President and I have profound differences. And many people think it's just over January 6th. And frankly, the fact that the president continues to insist that I had the right to overturn the election that day is a fundamental difference. The issue of fealty to the Constitution is not a small matter, but it's not just that. I mean, the reason that I cannot in good conscience endorse Donald Trump this year also has to do with the fact that he is walking away not just from keeping faith with the Constitution on that day, but also, Margaret, with a commitment to fiscal responsibility, a commitment to the sanctity of life, a commitment to American leadership in the world.
Hi again, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in Washington, D.C. I'm Michael Steele, and for Nicole Wallace, add another one to the list. Another individual who worked alongside Donald Trump in the White House who cannot support him and warns of the danger the ex-president poses. It's common practice that when a person applies for a job, the interviewer asks for a list of references. He or she wants to hear a little bit about this applicant, what they did in previous situations. It wants to hear from someone who witnessed them firsthand and how they behaved and what they thought. Well, the firsthand witnesses to Trump's previous experience as president are sending quite a signal. Do not put this man back in office. Pence is joining a remarkably large choir of former Trump administration officials who have come out against him. A list that includes, now, okay, settle in for this one, Trump's former attorney general, 2 former defense secretaries, 2 of his chiefs of staff, 2 national security advisors, his first ambassador to the United Nations, his former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, former secretaries of state, transportation, and education, 2 former press secretaries, a former communications director, a former deputy communications director, and a former aide to Trump's chief of staff. Keep in mind, their comments are not just, he wasn't the best or he wasn't that great. They are seriously warning us that he is a threat to our national security and American democracy. Like former Chief of Staff John Kelly saying that Trump is a person who admires autocrats and murderous dictators, a person that has nothing but contempt for our democratic institutions, our Constitution, and the rule of law. Or former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster saying after January 6th that Trump and other officials have repeatedly compromised our principles in pursuit of partisan advantage and personal gain. As friend of the show, Tim Miller asks of those who will be voting for Trump this time around, why do you think you know him better than those who saw him up close? The Bulwark reiterated the magnitude of Pence's decision not to endorse his former running mate. Quote, no American vice president has ever said that about his boss is unfit to serve. It is the most devastating possible observation from the most credible source in existence. Pence's refusal to endorse Trump should be part of the context of every single story about this campaign. And that is where we start this hour with Princeton University professor and political scholar Eddie Glaude, plus with me here at the table, opinion editor for the Washington Post and author of Prompt 2024 newsletter, Alexi.
Everyone sign up.
Yeah, everyone sign up. And Republican strategist Mike Murphy, all our MSNBC political analysts. I want to begin with you, Mike. Do you agree with that assessment of Pence not endorsing Trump? And how big a deal is this right now?
Well, the problem for Trump is every single serious person who worked for him is horrified at the idea he'd come back. The problem is in the current populist rage Republican Party, they don't have as much SWAT as they would have back in the good old days when we were a serious grown-up conservative party. The other problem is that Joe Biden's political strength is so weak right now. You know, we know from history that people want to fire the incumbent president. They put up with a really weak opponent sometimes. So, you know, I'm glad to see it. These people are patriots. It is the collapse of the old Vichy wing of the party that thought, well, we'll put up with them. We can kind of handle them. They're coming to their senses, but I don't think it's enough to necessarily stop them unless Biden can have the political comeback he really needs.
So I guess, Alexi, the question for me then, with what Pence has done, that particular non-endorsement, what does that say for, and it kind of touches on what Mike was just talking about, for the Nikki Haley's out there and others who are kind of still deciding whether or not they want to make that leap forward.
It certainly gives her more permission to do that, and that list that you just read off is a compelling list and a growing list of officials who aren't just non-serious people who have somehow ended up in Congress. They are actual folks who know the threat, as you mentioned, that Trump brings to national security and democracy. Nikki Haley, again, I think has to decide whether or not she is for the current Republican Party or for the country. There's no other way of looking at it. And I think while Mike Pence's non-endorsement is great, what's difficult to understand, I think, or wrap my brain around is, if we'll remember 2016, Pence delivered the Republican Party to Donald Trump. The Republican Party is now Donald Trump's. So for those folks to sort of be the ones who are not endorsing him, I'm not sure that it's ready to sort of penetrate the larger party, because Trump really kind of just took this party from Pence, which, again, he would not have had without Mike Pence.
So, Eddie, this begs the question, listening to both Mike and Alexei here, how many more calls from inside the House do you need? I mean, seriously, I mean, what else do you think it takes for people to understand exactly the point that Alexei made, that this is not about necessarily, oh, I'm voting for Joe Biden, therefore I'm down with everything Joe Biden's doing. It literally is about, I'm voting against extremism and for the country. That's the call from inside the House. What say you?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the choice is very clear. It's either you vote for fascism or neo-fascism, or you vote for this authoritarian figure, or you vote for democracy. I mean, it's very clear. There's no in between here. I think it's really important for us to understand, Mike Pence, think about how Mike Pence is polling among white evangelicals to get a sense of how influential he is in the party. And so I think part of what we have to do is to kind of really wrap our minds around what's motivating the base, Mike. And it's not about whether or not Donald Trump is a threat to security. It's not about his competency. It's not about whether or not he's honest or whether or not he's going to be a convicted felon. It's really about the fundamental argument around whose country is this? That populist fervor is rooted in grievance, deep-seated fear, and Trump seems to represent those grievances and fears and hatreds. And until those Republicans, those D.C. Republicans, as Mike Murphy talked about, respond to that, they're going to find themselves in some ways behind the eight ball.
So back in November, Mike, Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, talked about the response, his comments about Trump got. He said, quote, I came out and told people the awful things he said about wounded soldiers, and it didn't have half a day's bounce. You had his Attorney General Bill Barr come out and not a half a day's bounce. If anything, his numbers go up. It might even move the needle in the wrong direction. I think we're in a dangerous zone in our country. Talk to me about that zone we find ourselves in right now. Where does Mike Pence's comments land with voters? What did they hear when the guy that Donald Trump was obviously unconcerned about being harmed, if not killed, on January 6th, says what he says? What's the public response, and what does it mean?
Well, among Trump's chunk of the vote, which is not a majority, but it's enough to be competitive right now, there's no second-level thinking about this. It's tribal. The mathematical equation is, I'm right, you're evil. And if the other side is evil, you are a hero to oppose them with any means. You can storm the Capitol, you can shout, lock her up, you can choose what you choose to believe, you can ignore credentialed, smart people who know better than you, although that's dialed out, about what Trump is really like behind closed doors. So in that kind of world, you're either in the tribe or out, so they look and say, heretic, you're wrong, lying, deep state, all that sort of stuff. We've kind of created this new psychology of politics where you just armor up. Now, again, you've got, depending on the state, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 6 Republicans that aren't that interested in Trump. So there are cracks in it. But I just keep coming back to the point. Until Joe Biden can politically get a little stronger, Trump's got a shot. It's all about, weirdly enough, each party is running weak candidates. And with Trump, Joe Biden's got the one guy he can beat. Right. And with Biden, Trump's got the one candidate even he might be able to beat, which is what makes it such a depressing election. But that's the
where
reality.
we are. Right.
Yeah. And if there was a stronger Dem, these cuts would hurt more, because then there'd be there'd be more appeal there. People weren't just trying to fire the Democrat and putting up
Right.
with Trump, which is what's happening on the Republican side.
So